Glaminatrix Cosmetics is one of my favorite Australian indie brands, and they just came out with a palette called the Timeless Tones palette. And I'm really excited to show it in a little bit more detail because this color story in particular is really one that speaks to me. I feel like Glaminatrix really does glam neutrals very well, but I have really been waiting for a palette to have a few more cool toned options. So for me, this was a perfect answer to that. In this palette, you get 20 shades, 12 of which are matte and 8 of which are shimmers. And 3 of the shimmers are iridescents. I'm going to do swatches first and then get into some looks. First, we have the shade Classy, which is a really pretty kind of purpley pink iridescent. You actually get 3 iridescent eyeshadows in this palette, which I think just gives you so many options in terms of layering over other matte shadows, layering over shimmers. And next we have the shade Effortless, which I would describe as a really beautiful in-between green gold. And both of these first iridescents that I've shown have an overall very smooth texture, which I think will make them work really well as inner corner highlights. Next we have the shade Expensive, and I would describe this as a purple-leaning iridescent. This shade is slightly more textured than the first 2 that I swatched, but it still smooths out very well with your finger. Then we have the shade Delicate, and I would describe this as a really kind of high impact diamond shimmer. If you like shades that give a sheer diamond-like effect, then you would really enjoy this shade because it is so sparkly. And I actually made a whole video on shades and highlighters like these. Next, we have the shade Dignified, and I would describe this as having sort of a light purpley taupe base. It's a really pretty neutral shimmer that I think is going to go with a lot of the different neutral mattes in the palette. Glaminatrix has really stepped up when it comes to having really special sparkly shimmers in their palettes. Next, we have the shade Everlasting, and I would describe this as having a red-brown base with a pretty green shimmer. The shade actually reminds me a lot of the Moondust shadow from Urban Decay called Solstice. There's actually a few shades in here that remind me of Moondust shadows, but in my opinion, these shimmers are even more sparkly. Next, we have this shade Exquisite, and I would describe this as having a taupey base with a really pretty blue shift. I really like how a lot of the shades in here, while being neutral, have sort of that elevated neutral feel to them. The blue shift in this shade is going to allow it to pair so nicely with the blue and green tones in the palette. And then last but certainly not least, we have the shimmer called Grace. This is a black shimmer, another category of shimmers that I absolutely love. I actually made a dedicated YouTube video on black shimmers, both single shadows and in palettes. You can make the prettiest smoky eyes with these type of shades. Just really excited to see one included in the palette. Here's what the first set of shimmers that I talked about looks like swatched in the back of my hand. And here's what the second set of swatches looks like. Can't get over how spectacular these shimmers are. And now here's what the whole palette looks like swatched on my arm. I also want to mention this palette retails for about $62 US. And you can use an affiliate code to save. I'm going to go ahead and pop it up on the screen. When it comes to the color story of the palette, I think it's beautiful. The main thing that I would change is I would sub out the lighter mattes for some mid-tone mattes. Just for me personally, I know there's a couple of mattes that I'm probably not going to get too much use out of. For my first look, I'm taking the shade Polished, which is that lighter gray matte, and I'm dusting it all over the eyelid. And for this look, I'm using the brush set that is also launching with the collection. These are some beautiful brushes. They're synthetic, they're very soft, but as of right now, you have to buy the whole set to get the brushes rather than buy them individually. Next, I'm going to go in with the shade Chic, which is the black matte in the palette, and I'm just going to build up a smoky outer corner. Ultimately, my goal with this look was to do an oil slick eye look. Since you have a bunch of really dark mattes and you also have a bunch of iridescents, I think this palette is absolutely perfect for that type of look. I found these mattes to be super pigmented but blendable. No patching or skipping. I did use a primer on my eyes, the one that I always use, which is from About Face. And since I knew I was going to go in with a bunch of shimmers on the eyelid, I didn't blend the eyelid like crazy. Now I'm ready to layer my shimmers. I started off with Delicate, which is that diamond-like shimmer. I really love to apply my shimmers with my finger just to get a really high impact. I did have a few regrets about going so heavy-handed with this first shimmer because I wanted to layer a few other shimmers as well. Then I went in with Effortless and just layered it right over top. Effortless is that kind of green gold, really intense iridescent. And then I went in with the shade Expensive and I layered that right on top as well. I also used the shade Expensive as a highlight on the brow bone and on the inner corner. And then for my second look, I wanted to do a halo eye. So I started off with the really deep navy shade. That shade is called Suave, and basically what I did is I just built up some shadow in the outer corner and on the inner corner. I also didn't have any problems blending this matte. I think now that I had a chance to see what this shade looks like on the eye, I do wish that maybe it was a little bit lighter just so that there was a little more obvious difference between the blue matte and the black matte. I think you can see what I mean when you see them both on the eyes. I think it's a really pretty shade, but maybe just a little bit too close to the black. Next, I took the shade Elegant, which is more of a cobalt matte, and I just wanted to play around with this shadow placement. I wanted to put it on the area that was closest to the bridge of my nose. I've been trying to mix up my looks a little bit by playing around with matte placement. Then I decided to go in with the minty toned matte Glamour on the outside of the halo. I also just wanted to play around with the performance of a bunch of the different shades. I really didn't have any issues with blending these mattes. I have found that the matte formula from Glaminatrix is very reliable for me. And then for my shimmer shade, I wanted to use the shade Everlasting. That's a shade I said reminds me a little bit of the Urban Decay Moondust shadow called Solstice. I really love the effect of this shade on the lid. I definitely feel like if you're going for a palette that will give a perfect oil slick eye look, this will be a great option. Then I decided to go in with the shade Exquisite over top of Everlasting. I think there's some great options for layering shimmers with this palette. And I know I had previously mentioned that I wish there were some mid-tone shades in the palette, and I still think that would have helped with my looks a little bit. And then for the last part of my look, I went ahead and finished it off with the iridescent shade Classy. I used it as an inner corner and brow bone highlight. And here's both finished looks. I think if you're like me and you really enjoy deep and grungy looks, as well as really sparkly shimmers, there's some great options with this palette. I think if I had had a bit more time, I would have created a much more lighter blue look and maybe a more green look. And obviously, since there's some brown tone mattes, you could also make a look that was much more neutral than what I did. When it comes to my own personal preferences, I think this may be my favorite neutral palette from Glaminatrix. If you're into warmer tones, I'd probably recommend one of their other palettes, especially something like their Nearly Neutral palette. I also wanted to mention that if you're looking to pick up some singles while you're picking up a palette, their value bundles are really a great deal. I really hope you found this video helpful. Definitely let me know in the comments if you like this format of review style video, as well as anything else you'd like to see in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.